So, one of the things that kind of came up in our discussion last week, and thanks to the chat for kind of calling out this issue, is the difference between charity and justice. We talked about it some last week, but I think it's up for a more broader discussion of first of all, what is the difference between the two, and then what, in our view, preferences justice over charity? Because arguably they're both good in a way, right? And so what creates what makes one better than the other, and how do you define the two in that?
Well, everyone's looking at me, so I guess I'll start. Well, first of all, let's go ahead and establish definitions so that we know what we're talking about. To me, charity is helping alleviate a problem, not solve, alleviate. Charitable things would be like food drives for the hungry, working at a soup kitchen to give meals to the homeless, writing a check to UMCOR for disaster relief. Justice, on the other hand, is trying to find a cure for that problem. So justice would be, say, advocating for a higher minimum wage so that more people would not be on welfare and they would have more money, buy more things, the economy goes great, everyone's happy, America.
Yeah!
or, you know, civil rights legislation for equality in the 60s. I think that's a sign of justice, saying that these people are humans just like the rest of us. I'm glad that nothing like that has ever happened since then, and we don't need that anymore. Wait, I'm preaching. So that's what I think justice is. Justice is more of the prevent the problem, and charity is more of the, for lack of a better word, alleviate the symptoms.
Yeah, I think that gets at it. That justice deals with addressing the larger systems that create poverty, rather than simply treating the symptoms of poverty. You know, the analogy that I think I brought up last week is charity is if people are flowing by you on a river, charity is pulling people out of the river and drying them off. Justice is going up to the top of the river and finding out why are they ending up in the river in the first place. So it's charity deals with kind of the day-to-day needs, whereas justice starts to deal with this idea of structural sin. That the sin that's inherent in participating in unjust structures and attempting to alter those structures in such a way that there is less injustice in the world.
Yeah.
Which is a really circular definition, but it's how I think of it.
I think also charity makes those who are doing the giving feel really awesome. Like you hear people talk about how good it feels to give back. Justice is hard and you get really bloody. And it's dangerous and it requires a complete inversion of your expectations of the world. I mean, justice is incredibly messy. And charity makes us feel good. Justice doesn't really.
Well, justice causes us to realize that we don't have it all figured out and that we are complacent in sin.
Yep.
It's for us to say, whoops, my bad.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can fix it. Whereas charity is, I didn't have anything to do with that, but I can still help out because I'm outside of that system. When in fact you may actually be completely inside the system, holding the door open for more people to come inside said system.
I taught an adult Sunday school class. Can I talk about stuff like this? If I want name names?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't know. So I taught an adult Sunday school class, and I wanted to talk about sin. And so we talked about sin, and I talked about structural sin. And the story came out of a discussion I was having with a pastor friend right after the Boston Marathon bombing. And she said, you know, it's awful and terrible. 3 people died. It was horrible. but the same week a garment factory in Bangladesh exploded and we didn't hear anything about it. And I thought about it and I said, that's because one of our favorite games to play is That's Not My Sin.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
That is not anything I'm doing, and it makes it easier to say I'm not like those boys who planned the Boston Marathon bombing, instead of saying I benefit from cheap clothes, and from the work of other people who I don't know, who because of my cheap clothes that I am wearing died. And that's a much harder conversation to have, and it was so interesting, and it was one of the more conservative and older Sunday school classes, and the level of anger and discomfort at what I was saying and the conversations that came up, it was fascinating. And so I think it does have everything to do with structural sin, and it's easy to say my personal morality is what sin is, instead of looking at it and saying it is how we oppress other people. And charity gets us to deal a little bit more, I think, with the idea of personal morality. I'm a good person. I give money to charity. And less with what are the systems I'm complicit in, and how am I benefiting from these unjust systems?
But I think it requires a level of abstract thought that is difficult to explain, right? This is an abstract idea. If I am watching porn, that is clearly a sin. Okay, actually, porn is a perfect example of this.
Porn is pretty great, Trey.
No, stick with me on this. Porn is.
I don't want to. It's porn.
Do you need to go sit outside, Stephen?
Yes, if we're having this talk.
I'm listening to you.
Okay, porn's a perfect example of this, right? Looking at watching pornography is clearly a lustful sin, right? And that's easy to talk about. The structural sin of porn is much more difficult to talk about. This is probably a woman that has been forced into this, beyond the mate. I don't know that much about this, but I really don't.
And there could be some people who choose it for a career, but it's still, then you have
the
objectification of women.
The objectification of women. And so there's these larger structural issues that you're participating in by watching porn. And so one is really easy to explain, right?
Yeah.
Don't watch porn, it's lustful. Absolutely. Don't watch porn, it's lustful. But it also continues the objectification of women, and it oppresses women, and often is connected with, sexual slavery and all of those really tough issues that it plays into larger structures of oppression that are much more difficult to explain. It's much easier just stop looking at porn because it's lustful, but there are justice issues wrapped up in it that I think draw this distinction.
Well, then when thinking about justice versus charity, I think there's a what's a good word for this? I think there's a stages process, like the stages of grief. There's a stages of justification. You start with obliviousness. You don't know there's a problem. You're buying the shirts. You're looking at the naked lady. You're you're
gross.
Okay, fine.
And we're off the
Boys.
rails.
And we're off in South Korea.
Sorry, go on, dear.
Anyway, so you have that. You don't realize there's a problem. Then there's justification, or then there's realization. There is a problem. Garment workers died. You start realizing someone in the industry that has passed away due to AIDS or something like that. I don't know.
There actually it was
porn legislation.
Apparently some sort of AIDS scare in the porn community recently.
I honestly did not know that.
HuffPo, that keeps me on top of these
Anyway,
things.
and then you get to the realization that there's a problem, and then that leads to justification. Oh, if I didn't buy those shirts, they wouldn't have jobs anyway. So it's good. I mean, it's a tragedy, yes, but at least they were getting some money. Or, that woman, if she didn't have this outlet, or that man, for instance, they might be prostitutes.
Or they wouldn't have jobs if we weren't buying those clothes.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then you move to charity. How can I help out? I'll send money to the relief agency. I'll do that because it makes me feel good and I'm doing a good thing. And then that moves through learning more about the stuff that goes on, learning more about the processes that have gotten people to, not only overseas, but in this country too, people who are in poverty or homeless because of predatory lending. People who can't find a job because they have post-traumatic stress disorder and they're mentally unstable, for lack of a better word. And then you start to want to go towards justice. I think justice is ultimately what the goal of charity should be. Is it necessarily the goal of charity for all people? No. Some people are going to be just fine doing charitable works for the rest of their lives. That's great. We need people to do charity. Charity is a great thing. There's nothing wrong with charity, but we also need people to move forward so that the people who do charity can move on to other charitable causes, because we're starting to take out the systematic sin that we have. This is copyright Stephen Doss, all rights reserved, all that good stuff. I'll write a book or something.
One of the bravest sermons I've ever heard preached was to a wealthy congregation, and the minister listed all of the good and worthy charitable things that the congregation did, and then said, but wouldn't it be great if we didn't need to do any of these because there was justice?
How many monocles dropped?
Several.
But I think that's what sets up the hierarchy, or the preference, or the why the Bible talks so much about justice, is because it starts to eliminate the need for charity. And that doesn't mean it doesn't eliminate the need for treating each other charitably, but charity as we do it, putting band-aids on the problem. And Kathleen's right. There does need to continue to be people who hand out band-aids.
Yeah.
I'm not advocating the closing of every soup kitchen. What I think we're talking about here is making soup kitchens an unnecessary concept.
Yeah.
The same way we don't have a lot of polio treatment facilities, because we've managed to effectively eradicate polio in the United States through a vaccine that could be produced cheaply. And that started out as a charitable thing. Give money to the March of Dimes. But it turned into this really cool justice thing where, everyone, polio dropped to the floor, and we actually systemically eliminated a major cause of pain. In a way that, everyone, or just about everyone in the U.S., and starting to grow more and more worldwide, are getting these vaccines that can just fundamentally eliminate an illness.
Yeah. I mean, Christ says that you will always have the poor with you. It doesn't mean we can stop wanting to... I don't want to say get rid of them because it sounds like something really horrible.
So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek to make everyone's condition equally good.
And equally good, yes.
That, this isn't necessarily about, I'm not Marx. This isn't necessarily about dragging down the rich. It is making sure that, this kind of, this John Rawls thing, that everyone should have an equal opportunity to succeed, and we should leverage society such that that's possible.
Yeah, I just want to say that I personally am not advocating that we have the rich come down and we have a... No, I don't think there's anything wrong with being wealthy.
Objectively.
Objectively, yes, objectively. The problem comes when that wealth is based on oppression of someone else. And I think ultimately the point of Christ in that socialist claptrap known as the Sermon on the Mount is not to bring the wealthy down so that everyone is living in poverty so we can all know. No, it's to bring the oppressed, the marginalized, more up. And I think that's what justice does. Justice isn't designed to hurt anyone. Not really hurt anyone.
Well, and loss of unearned privilege is not the same thing as oppression.
No, it's not.
So by bringing people up, you will have people that will get their knickers in a twist about how they're now oppressed. There was a great, was it the former Archbishop of Canterbury? Who, what's his face? Who said that Western Christians need to grow up and get over it. They're not oppressed and they have no idea what actual oppression is. So loss of relative privilege is not the same thing as oppression.
No.
There you go. Sorry, dear. Go on.
No, you just basically said what I was going to say anyway.
Sorry.
No, I think...
Thanks a lot.
But I also think the other thing is that this kind of justice is inextricably linked with love of God. I think that's why the prophets are so cool, because there's this constant back and forth between what does it mean to oppress the poor and what is turning away from God. And in the end, they are one and the same. And I think that that's a really powerful, I mean, then that's the whole Good Samaritan thing, right? Mm-hmm. About go and do likewise. Who is your neighbor? What is the greatest commandment? All of that, that's where that comes from. And so I think that as people of faith, these struggles are really, really important for us. Because there are so many biblical links between love of God and love of neighbor. And that neighbor is not just the people just like us sitting next to us.
Mm-hmm.
And to truly love neighbor is to make it so that there are no structural impediments in the way of your neighbor. That, part of justice is that everyone, my personal background, I was a Teach for America Corps member. And the fundamental thesis of TFA is one day all children will have access to a good education. That if you don't have access, if you create a system of differential education, people don't have the same access to in life because they're held back by bad schools. Or it's making sure that your neighbor can earn a decent wage and a decent job, or that your neighbor doesn't go bankrupt because they got sick with, cancer caused by handling chemicals their whole life. Or whatever that is, that loving your neighbor isn't just giving them a cup of sugar when they're out of work, but making it so that they have adequate protections that they keep their job more.
And just to bring up one last thing, I come from the state of Alabama. That's where I grew up. Lovely state. If you can visit. People are nice. No. That's not Christian making fun of Alabamians. However, that state just passed legislation to give tax breaks to families so they can afford to get out of failing schools and go to non-failing schools. So to get out of, I'm just going to name high schools. I don't know if they're failing or not. Don't hold this against me if you're from Alabama. But it's like basically saying you can go from Inslee High School, north of Birmingham, and you get to go to Hoover, which is always a top 50 school in the nation. And while the intention behind that was probably good, and it was probably saying, okay, this is a way we can fight for justice by giving people the opportunity to go from these failing schools to non-failing schools. The problem with that comes from how they're doing it.
Can I tell the story?
Yeah, go ahead, Miss Kathleen.
In Progressive Christian Stereotype Tag, I was listening to NPR in the Prius, and
which wine goes best with your Prius?
And they interviewed a woman, and she hadn't finished high school, and she told her story. She said, I had to get off the bus and go into the cotton fields, and I really want my grandson to graduate from high school. And she goes, what kind of good is this going to do me?
Mm-hmm.
So I get a tax credit. I still have to find someone to lend me money to buy gas so I can get to the new school. Where am I going to have the time to do this? I can't do this. And I think that that's a really good example of charity versus justice.
Yeah.
Justice is working on fixing the school. Charity is handing out a tax credit.
And on that note, it is time to end for this week. Thank you so much for joining us on episode 2 of SYN Boldly. We will be back next week, live streaming at 8 p.m. at endfear.org/live. If you have any feedback or ideas of topics you'd like to see on future shows, please email us at synboldly@endfear.org. Hit us up on the Twitters at @synboldly, or find us on Facebook at facebook.com/signyourname, the Sign Your Name Project. We will be back same time next week. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and end fear by signing your name. Good night.
This is the Inside Your Name Project. The podcast is hosted boldly, and you should listen to it. Go tell your friends and tell your family, 'cause they like this too, especially if they are,
You lost it, man.
I lost it.
Steven has been singing made-up songs.
Bye, everybody.